Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Gross. I'm an extension educator in Central Michigan, soil health, cover crops, and the northern part of the Central Michigan. So really excited to see the virtual tour. And Dean was right from the get-go that coming on a virtual farm tour like this, we can get to see different parts of the state and some of the challenges that they have. It's really interesting, the innovation that the farmers have implemented on their farms, the tools and equipment, and some of the things they've done to solve the mystery, solve the challenges of interseeding cover crops in sand and corn. And you know, it's interesting that the successes that they've had. Always asked to reach out to those farmers, those educators that were on those videos to help get those questions answered for more clarification. We're going to work through some questions that are in the chat box, but first I'd like to kind of acknowledge some of the individuals and organizations that have supported the MSU cover crop program over the years. We're really grateful for some of the opportunities that they have given us, providing us with seed, with funds to do some of this research that's very important. Next, Renee's going to put another poll up. We still like to gather information. I'd ask you to fill that out so we can get more information. Helps guide our research and helps guide our programming for cover crops, for the cover crop teams. So we really appreciate if you'd fill that out as we move forward. What I'm going to do then is start to move toward the questions in the chat box. What I'd like to do is go through them. There's a number of questions in the chat box. If you still have extra questions, please put them in, and then we'll try to get them answered before we go into our breakout rooms. So I'd also like to acknowledge, you'll see on the screen, the cover crop team, both on campus and off. These individuals really support work and provide the research and leadership in cover crop education that we have here at MSU. So we're real grateful for that. So I'm going to go in and into the chat box and start asking some of the questions that have been put in. I think I can maybe try to assign some of those. One of the first questions is shade tolerance. Where can we get the information on the shade tolerant species? And I think I'm going to direct that to Karen, Dr. Renner. I know you've done some work on that. So Karen?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hi out there. I recognize some of the names in the list on my big screen. So yeah, shade tolerance. So we searched a lot for information on that, just across all sorts of resources, and it's really tough to find that. Some of the work that Caleb is doing, Ortner, in the growth chamber, we're looking at shade and no shade and looking how species respond. So as a lot of you know, crimson clover appears to be a decent clover species for in the shade. That's why you see a lot of people using it. Annual ryegrass does well in the shade, and radish does too, and so does turnip. But all of them do better in the sun. But when we're in an interseeded system, we get shade. So we're working on that, and others are too. But experience is a good teacher, as many of you know. Some seem to do better and some don't. So I'll stop there.
Karen, I want to follow up with just a little question that came about the cereal rye versus the annual ryegrass in your study. Probably shade tolerance. Is there a reason you picked one versus the other then?
We just opted for annual ryegrass for some reasons other than shade tolerance, but annual rye or cereal rye work okay, as many are on this call this morning, and they could chime in, and we just have a blow up here of our audio, but both will work well. Some growers prefer annual ryegrass, some growers prefer cereal rye.
Thank you, Karen. The next question is what rates were used, and I think that was after the North Central region video. So Dean, I think you led the planning of that plot.
Yes, I did. We planted that plot there, and when the crimson clover radish mix, we did a typical 60-40 mix on that. Crimson clover at 60% and the radish at 40%. And what those are the percentage of the normal seeding rate per acre that you would find in a lot of the literature. So in the case of the crimson clover, that's about 8 pounds per acre at 60%. And For the radish, it's 3 pounds per acre. And I'd like to point out, these rates are pure live seed. So make sure you check your seed tag. Particularly crimson clover can get you because there's crimson clover out there that can have as much as a 40% coating on it. So if you don't adjust for those types of things, your seeding rate can get low, and that may be why some people are not quite getting the results they'd like to get.
Thanks, Dean. The next question you might want to just jump in on is, what variety of plants would you recommend for broadcast seeding?
When it comes to broadcast seeding, we like to tend towards the smaller seeds. We find it's much more difficult to get the large seeds established from broadcast. Things like peas, beans, a lot of those bigger seeds. You don't get enough seed soil contact just setting them on top of the surface, and they're also really appetizing to the critters around that are looking for something to eat. Pretty easy to see. So we've had our best success with some of the smaller seeds like crimson clover, red clover. Annual ryegrass, again, is a smaller seed. Also, the cereals do really well too. So oats, cereal rye, wheat, barley. It's when you get into some of the bigger, what I'd call more exotic seeds, you may have some problems with those.
Thanks, Dean. Good practical information. I think I'm going to draw on Dr. Renner or maybe Dr. Sprague to catch the next question. What are some of the herbicide programs used for the corn interseeding fields? It seems like it's a big hurdle.
Yep, I'll let Christy talk on that one. We have a fact sheet and we've looked a lot at that.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen mentioned, we do have a fact sheet, and we have really done a lot of work looking at the various pre-emergence herbicides as well as post-herbicides that can be used, and really kind of focused on the annual ryegrass as well as kind of the tillage radish. And there are quite a few different programs. One of the key things is, particularly if you're going to be seeding in grass, a lot of our pre-herbicides like things like Dual, some of the acetochlor products like Harness, a lot of times we do not get good establishment because we don't have enough time between that and some of the interseeding. Some of the applications early in the season, and if you're doing some later season, basically, kind of just before harvest, you might be able to get away with. But we do have a good fact sheet that is in the back of the MSU weed control guide that does outline a lot of the products that can be used on some of those different cover species that we've looked at.
And I'll just add, like if you're just interseeding one single species, it's a little bit easier to come up with a herbicide program, as you might think. If you're interseeding a mixture, it's much more difficult to come up with a herbicide program. Christy has a breakout session on weed control, and that will be recorded. So if you're in a different breakout session, you can always pick that one up later, and I'm sure they'll have a discussion on that.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I think this is from Rich's video. Phil, I think maybe you can touch on this. Any problems planting green? Any tips for someone trying it for the first time?
Thanks, Paul. Unfortunately, Rich wasn't able to join us today. They had a death in the family, and so my sympathies to them, but I'll try and answer your question. Some of the things that I've seen in the thumb area is if we have a grass like a cereal rye that's planted in the fall and then going to corn in the spring, if we have a long period of wet, cool weather, the cereal rye continues to grow. It really seems to jump, and if it gets too big, then we have a challenge of trying to terminate that rye, plant the corn into soils that have rye that might be 4 or 5 feet tall. So that's probably the biggest challenge that I've seen about planting green.
Okay, thanks, Phil. The second part of that question is interseeding vetch, and I think I'm going to try to toss that one to Dan Brainerd because I think he has the most experience with vetch.
Okay, let's see. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I've not done that for a while. We've used, so vetch I think is not as shade tolerant as things like clover. It's also a bigger seed, so some of the challenges people brought up with that. are important to keep in mind. Depending what other crops you're growing, it can also be a weed. So if you're a grower of winter wheat, for example, that's a dangerous one to get involved with. On the plus side, nitrogen fixer, we had pretty good luck establishing it in vegetables, which don't intercept as much light as corn. So I've never tried it in denser field crops, but my guess is it would not perform as well as the clovers, certainly as a legume source, but might be a little bit better at suppressing weeds, and you get a little bit more vigorous growth in the spring and more nitrogen early, depending what your rotational crop is. It could be a good fit.
Thanks, Dan. I know that I've had a little experience with vetch in row crops, and it is a great nitrogen producer, but there's some challenges is in managing it. There's also some challenges with hard seed, and it doesn't mix well with winter wheat crops as well. So good information. Thank you. I'll kind of throw this out to the team. In what situations would you not recommend interseeding?
I'll jump in. So like the guys in the thumb that are on 22-inch rows for sugar beet or for other reasons, we did some early work in 22s and we ran into some issues with that. The canopy was so dense, we couldn't get good cover establishment even with rains, and that canopy closed so quickly that when it did rain, not much of the rain reached the soil surface. So my experience, which is limited, I'm not from the thumb and I don't grow corn and interseed in the thumb, was 40,000 population, especially in 22-inch rows. We had some more difficulties. I wouldn't do it, but maybe some people on would say, yo, we do it and we're good.
Paul, I'm going to say that when we are looking at interseeding, we had very poor results in 2019, and that was because it was so dry. We planted the seed and had extended periods of really dry weather, and so there was no germination on that seed. It just stayed in the soil, and so because of that, we had very poor emergence and limited amount of cover crops after harvest, which sometimes you have a crop failure. Sometimes it doesn't work exactly the way you want, and so that was one of the challenges that we had.
And I would echo that because we've been doing interseeding with farmers across the state and ourselves for like 5 years now. And we get a dry year like what Phil's saying, and we struggle. And that's why James DeDecker, ourselves, and that's why we're looking at different types of ways to establish interseeding. We certainly know we can drill and get usually a very good interseeded stand, but a lot of growers are interested in something a bit different than a drill. And you get a dry year and seed on the surface, and that's problematic.
And we also had an issue in with Jack Thornton, and he's not on, but Greg White, our local NRCS, is on, and we had the opposite. We had a great year. We had wonderful weather, and we did it in soybeans, and the cover crops actually got too large. We interseeded it, and they took off. So there was an issue there with the cover crop being taller than the beans at harvest time, so you also have to watch it from that angle too, make sure it doesn't get out of hand.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'd love to just keep the conversation going, but we've got to move people into the breakout room. So Renee, would you share the results of the poll before we do that, if you would? Okay, so we can see a number of reasons why people are using, or why would they consider using cover crops. So this is great. So we're going to move into our breakout rooms now, and I'd like to remind everyone that they're going to last approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and we're not going to be coming back. So you can stay in there as long as you'd like. I'd like to remind the moderators to make sure you turn on the record on those sessions. The questions that were unanswered in the chat box will be answered. These recordings are all going to be placed online in the very near future. I'd also like to remind participants that in the chat box, you're going to have the opportunity to get your fill out the forms for your CCA credits, for your UP credits, and to fill out the evaluation. So really appreciate the questions, really appreciate information, really appreciate the participation.